Welcome to Diocese Insight, where we take some time to share with you the different events and programs in the Catholic Church here in the Rio Grande Valley. Joining us today is Larry Loff from Brownsville. Thank you for joining us, Larry.
Pleasure.
Now, Larry, I know that you are a Professor Emeritus from UTRGV, but you also have a long history with historical projects.
I've had the pleasure of teaching young people to learn how to restore old buildings, but then also I've had the pleasure of being able to work on a lot of the restoration projects in general in Brownsville. And Brownsville is such an interesting place in that it probably has the second highest number of historic buildings in the state of Texas, and hardly anybody knows it. There's a huge amount of historic fabric that needs to be saved.
And we have quite a little gem in Santa Maria, don't we?
Absolutely.
And it needs some attention, but let's talk a little bit about the history.
Santa Maria, first of all, is an interesting place. In the 1890 census, it was the second largest community in Cameron County. It was far bigger than, except for Brownsville, it was absolutely the most thriving town in the entire county. And it's hard to imagine that now when we drive through Santa Maria. Well, why was it? Well, it was because in 1890, it was the next big steamboat stop upriver from Brownsville. And so you took a steamboat upriver, and Santa Maria was the next big stop. And so there were a number of stores. The fort had a small base there. There was a telegraph. There were a number of groceries. It was a thriving community, and so that's why you have this kind of interesting brick church that sprung up in what we now think is in the middle of nowhere.
That's amazing. I mean, again, so much history to this beautiful little church that unfortunately its doors have been closed for quite some time.
Right. It was built at an interesting time. Its cornerstone was laid in December 29th, 1880, in a snowstorm, in a rare snowstorm. We only have them once every 100 years or so. And then the building was completed in June 29th of 1882. So it was, and it served the community for the next, almost 100 years. Services were held way up into the 1970s, and then they began to taper off a little bit. And then I think in 1891 it was closed almost exclusively, and finally closed in 1995. Okay,
I was trying to do the math.
No. 1990 is when it began to phase out, and 1995 is when the doors were closed once and for all.
Wow, it's such a shame because it's still quite a jewel. It has so much history in there. We can just go back in time into 1880, this snowstorm, and what life was like in the community at that time.
Well, again, it was such a thriving community, and everything was made by the local people. The bricks were made across the street at what looks like that old hacienda that's across the street. The bricks were made locally, and all the work was done locally, although the plans for the building were actually done by Father Kerlem, who had died 20 years before, but nevertheless his plans were still around for the cathedral in Brownsville, and it essentially is a miniature of that.
That's amazing. Again, so you're such a wealth of knowledge here, and really giving us some of the background to the church that many people are not even familiar with. They drive by Old Military Highway and might miss it if they're not looking for it. Absolutely.
In particular, not realizing that just behind that old hacienda across the street, steamboats used to pull up and stop and pick up cargo and passengers.
See, I can't even picture it. I can't even picture that time in history, and to think that this was one of the second largest communities in
Cameron County.
In Cameron County. Yeah. That's amazing. So what a joy for you to be working on these historical projects, because you get to do this research and really reimagine this building.
Old buildings are wonderful because they're beautiful in the way they look. But why are they more important? They're more important because of the story they all tell about the people in the community that loved them, that worked in them, that built them. It's the story of people that's the reason why old buildings are so important to us and they need to be saved, more than just the beauty of this well-built brick building that was at the side of the road.
Well, and I'm sure that you have, with your research, you've come across some of these stories. Are there some that you can share with us about the people of the time?
Well, the person who I've gotten to know over the years was the last deacon who worked at that church when it was operating, and Deacon Saldivar. He's an older gentleman, but the pride that he had, you can clearly see the love he had for the community and that church. I mean, and so, you know, again, there are many churches. For example, many churches that were affected over the years as things have moved on. For example, that church lost its steeple in the hurricane of 1933. And so many changes over the years.
Amazing, amazing. And so now there are efforts to try to rebuild it or put it back to its a more usable condition.
Luckily, it was such a wonderful thing that the diocese got a grant some years ago that helped put a roof back on that building and to help stabilize that building so that there was time to come back in the following years and really go to the next step in restoring it. When I first saw that church, before we did that work, the roof had completely gone, and you went inside and there was nothing but a series of boards that you could see the sky through, except for one place. And that was one place in that church still had its roof, and that was over the altar, where the original altar still survives today in great shape, because it was the one place that was protected from the weather.
Amazing. Thanks be to God as well. So what comes next? What are some of the essential things that need to happen?
First thing I think is, first we need to find, hopefully the community comes back together and decides that they want it to be their church again. Because without a community, a church is an empty thing. And so you can restore a building, but if you don't have that community that takes care of it and takes it as its own, it's lost again in another decade or two. So we need to, on one hand, look for resources and find money to restore that church, but on the second place is hopefully a community will come back together and say, yes, we want this to be our church. And because without that living body, a church is an empty thing.
Absolutely. So have you been in contact with some of the families in the area who are showing an interest?
We met a couple of times years ago before the emergency stabilization, and it was a little bit indecisive as to exactly, because we were not able to say, yes, we're bringing resources to rebuild a church. We were only talking in hypotheticals, and of course people wonder about, yes, well, will it ever happen or not? So really that's, I think, another step that needs to happen. And then approach people who their families were part of that church at one time, and some of the local farmers and community members, and raise the money little by little to do the restoration of that church in several phases. The emergency stabilization has been done. Then the next thing to do is to go further and go back and redo the walls. I think it once had a canvas ceiling, like a lot of the old churches. So there are lots of pieces of this that need to come together to complete the work.
Absolutely.
Several phases yet.
So have you considered doing a workshop? Because I'm sure that there would be a lot of interest in learning a little bit more about the history, particularly the community at that time. Because as you mentioned, it's not about the building, it's about the stories and the people.
It is about the stories, because otherwise a building is just nothing but a collection of bricks and windows. It always is those stories that make it a historic building really an important thing.
Absolutely. Anything else that you'd like to add about this project?
No, it's just I'm lucky to have lived long enough that hopefully I can get to see the next phases in saving that church, because it is well worth the effort.
And you've been able to, like, as you said, to talk to the deacon who worked there, who served the parish, and who was from the community. And hopefully there will be others who will come forward and share some of their stories, and kind of take us back into time.
Right.
And then from this whole process, I imagine that there will be new stories emerging.
Absolutely, because we have just begun to collect those stories, because as people come back, they will all have their stories about events that happened here, about ceremonies that happened here, funny things, sad things, weddings, funerals, and the full range of things that happen in a community.
Right, and we can't forget our history and where we come from, and not just forget. It comes to a point where we don't even know the history.
We don't know the history yet. Those of us that work with historical associations realize that most of our history is still in shoeboxes in grandma's back closet. And those stories are little by little bit getting lost, because after a generation, nobody knows what was this picture, who were the people in it. Our stories, our history is being lost, because as we move forward, it gets farther and farther to back, and the old folks that carried those stories forward are beginning to be lost and passed away also.
Well, we're very fortunate, Larry, in that you have such an interest in finding those stories and sharing those stories. How did you become involved in this?
In this one, or in history in general?
In history in general, and also teaching your students the value of restoring buildings, but that crucial component about the stories.
My grandparents went through the revolution in Mexico in 1910, and I grew up hearing about the revolutionaries that ride into town, and these wonderful stories that my grandparents would tell about living in Mexico at the turn of the last century. And so history was always such a fascinating thing to me. And so I realized that these stories and their buildings are critically important. They're wonderful things, like I said, as we refer to it as a touchstone, a touchstone. A building is a touchstone for things that have happened and learning. A point of departure.
A point of departure. I like that. Yeah. And I can see that you have a big interest in your own story, talking about your parents and their history, and so you have made that also a personal mission.
Absolutely, because those of us that love history usually grew up hearing history first in the family, and then learning how important it was. So. Right.
Well, so I encourage our viewers as well, because we all have stories to tell, and to take out those shoe boxes, to take out those old photo albums, because we just never know. They could be damaged, they could get lost, and this is the time to share them with our grandchildren, our children, our nephews and nieces, so those stories aren't lost.
Right.
And so again, thank you for the work that you are doing with Our Lady of Visitation Church in helping to tell those stories. And today we were very blessed in that you took us back in time for a while to where there were steamboats passing through our area. And I had no idea that that was happening in the 1800s. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think I'm comfortable with that. I think we set the stage, at least.
Thank you so much. And thank you. We'll be right back.
Good morning. My name is Lydia Pesina, and I serve as Director of the Family Life Office for the Catholic Diocese of Brownsville. And we're so happy to be spending some time with you this morning. I know for myself, especially because I've had the great blessing to be able to work for the diocese for a few years. Actually, August 1st was 31 years for me. Doesn't feel like it. And one of the great things about this ministry is that it's always new, just like regular family life. something is always different, something is always coming up that may be challenging, but always there's something that where the Lord leads us and teaches us and continues to help us to be transformed into the people He has uniquely created us to be. And I'm so excited because in our Family Life Office, we have a couple of staff members. One of our staff members is here with us this morning, and I'm so glad that we're doing this together, Lena.
I am too, and my name is Lena, as Lydia mentioned, and I'm the new Associate Director here, along with our Associate Director, Blanca Sainz. Very happy to be here. I actually moved down here with my husband and our children from New Jersey.
And one of the things that we want to talk about this morning a little bit is a little bit about the family life cycle. Because the family life cycle, one of the things in a course that we teach called Ministries with Family 101, is we talk about the importance of looking at wherever we are in our family life cycle, that throughout our life, in every stage, there are rewards, at every stage there are losses, and at every stage there are spiritual tasks. For example, the work that Lena and Blanca and I do in the Family Life Office is very varied, a lot of stages of the family life cycle. But one of the areas where we do spend quite a lot of time with is on marriage preparation. And at that stage where couples are getting ready to get married, we look at young adult stage and also coming into, getting married, that some of the rewards, of course, are beautiful. I mean, spending time together, dating, looking forward to spending the rest of their life together. Those are some of the rewards, but there's also losses. One of the losses is they have to let go of their family of origin. And as much as we look forward to being with the person we most love in the world for the rest of our life, we are always connected to our family of origin. But as we look at the life cycles, one of the interesting things is Lena and I are kind of at different stages of the family life cycle. I'm more at the grandparent stage. And Lena, as you can tell, is more as a young family stage, a young family with children. So, like I know when you and your husband first had your first child, what would you say some of those rewards were?
Well, many rewards. I think the first one is just being able to see that our love created another human being and just being in awe of being able to do that. And just learning all the different things that a baby does. I think also seeing how the help from the grandparents came in and how much joy they also shared in with us as well. So I think those are one of the rewards. And
what were some of the losses, though?
Oh my goodness, there were quite a few of losses. Loss of sleep was definitely one of them. Loss of just not being able to put yourself first.
Exactly.
That child now comes first.
And that's a wonderful teaching in a sense, very transformative, where we learn what Jesus is teaching us about that self-emptying love, that we do the loving thing when we feel like it and when we don't feel like it. And when you have babies, you learn that crucially, because whether you feel like feeding them or changing their diaper, you do it, and you do it with much love.
Yes.
And what do you think are some of the spiritual tasks in just kind of having a new family? I mean, having children be part of that.
So I think prior to having children, we were very focused on our own prayer time by ourselves, and then together now we focus on our prayer for our children and how we're going to pray with them, knowing that we're so tired.
Exactly.
So I think that was one of them, and being able to, or juggling the plan of, okay, we're going to Mass with a baby, and how are we going to sit through Mass and listen and really absorb with a baby who's crying or his diaper changed. So learning all those things.
And that's always so exciting. I mean, my hat's off to young families, because I just really relish seeing young families at a parish Mass, because lo hacen con mucho esfuerzo. They have to really, prepare everything. They have to lug with them for the baby, and the children are wiggly. It is a challenge, but it's a wonderful challenge, isn't it? I think the consistency of being able to continue to surround our children with the Word of God, to surround our children with knowing that everything belongs to God, that to putting Him first and to praying, even when it's messy. I think I mentioned in the last little segment we did that I really believe that a family life is sacred. It's sacred, but it's messy. It's not nice and neat. Eating around the dinner table, is a challenge. I would say at every age of the life cycle.
I agree.
If families have teenagers, everybody's coming and going. It's difficult sometimes to be able to spend that time. And yet we know the beauty of how when we do that, when we come together and sit around, even if it's not nice and neat, that we're nourished, not only nourished in our bodily needs and the food, the delicious meal that we've prepared or kind of, quickly put together, but I think nourished by the communion that we share. And I do think there's a great connection between our family table and the table of the Lord, because around our family table is where we sit around and we talk, we listen to each other. Sometimes, we disagree or we argue or we're not in a good mood, but that's also where we reconcile, where we worry about bills and homework and everything that goes with family life. But that's in essence what we take to the table of the Lord on Saturday or Sunday, where we're nourished by the Word of God and where we're nourished by the Eucharist as we, partake of it. And also hopefully that extends what we do to what we're going to do for others, because every family has to be able to give of who they are for others. And I'm in admiration of a young family like yours that is one that's very, that's there to serve the Lord. And as a young family, that's very admirable.
Yes, and I agree. I think our bringing or serving the Lord, it's what brings us meaning and purpose, and we're happy to be able to pass this down to our children. I know they're going to encounter many moments in their life where their faith will be challenged, and where they'll have the opportunity to really put their faith to the test. But I think that if we are living or truly living a Christian life at home, where we show them that prayer, it's beautiful, and that we need it. We need to be nourished, just as we're nourished physically, that we're nourished spiritually. I think that they're going to see this and know that the faith is real. But if we present something that is vague and that where the Lord really doesn't fit into our lives, they're not going to be able to witness to a real life of faith.
And so hopefully we'll be able to continue with some of these conversations in the coming weeks. But as a reminder, we want, for us to continue to help one another remember that everything belongs to God, and that as our Creator, He loves us immensely and He loves us intimately. May we continue to serve Him in the best way possible. Have a wonderful Sunday.
I'd like to welcome you back for another segment of For the Sake of Tradition. Last time we talked a little bit about the liturgical year and the liturgical seasons as we wrestled a little bit with both Advent and Christmas. So today we want to spend some time talking more about Lent and Easter as two of those other seasons that we have in our liturgical year. Lent being predominantly a period that we focus on preparation, but also the bigger highlight is about penance, about what are we doing differently. See, on Ash Wednesday, which begins the season of Lent, is a time that we hear the readings, the same readings from every year, that focuses on the three pillars, if we want to call them, the three pillars of Lent, which are fasting, almsgiving, and penance. These three pillars that helps us better interiorize what's happening, better interiorize and prepare ourselves for that great celebration that we will celebrate at the end of those 40 days. So Easter is what we look forward to, the resurrection of the Lord. The resurrection of the Lord that helps us count back those weeks. And so Easter is one of those movable feasts that once we figure out that day, we go back in time to figure out Ash Wednesday. That's why at times Ash Wednesday is sooner or later. Like last year, it was on the 14th. This year, it's going to be a little bit farther down the road. So we're looking forward to in March. March being a time that we begin with Ash Wednesday, we begin with the season of Lent. And so I want to take some time to read paragraph 1169. It says, "Therefore Easter is not simply one feast among others, but the feast of feasts, the solemnities of solemnities, just as the Easter is the sacrament of the sacraments. St. Athanasius calls Easter the Great Sunday, and the Eastern churches call Holy Week the Great Week. The mystery of the resurrection in which Christ crushed death permeates with its powerful energy our old time until all is subjected to him." So Lent is that time that we as a church reflect and think about the suffering, the passion of Christ, but also is a time for us to think about and consider, where are we on our journey? Are we ready to be able to be buried and to resurrect with him? Remembering our baptism, remembering that baptismal call that we received. And so it is that Holy Week that kind of gives us a better understanding of what we celebrate every Sunday. Holy Week being those days that we begin with the Passion or the Palm Sunday, and that leads us to the Triduum, the Sacred Triduum, those 3 days. So Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and leading up to the Easter Vigil. The Easter Vigil being that great day that we will welcome many into the church. They will be fully initiated that night. We will see the fire burning. We will see the blessing of the water, those symbols that are dear and near to us. It is in the Easter season that we reflect based on the writings of the Acts of the Apostles that helps us better understand what it means to be a Christian, to follow Jesus and to be joyful, to be full of peace, like Jesus told them when he met them, when they were afraid and closed in the room. Rejoice and be glad. Peace be with you. That is the way of the Christian, to be joyful, to be peaceful, because we know that our Christ, our Lord, has resurrected and has triumphed over sin and death. So Easter is also a season. It's not just one day. It's a time that the church gives us to be able to celebrate the great mystery of God's love for us. So I want to take this time to thank you for joining us. And on the next segment, we would like to focus more on ordinary time. Ordinary time is not as ordinary as we think.